Hi, I'm Jake with Benelli, and I have lead gunsmith Ethan here, and today we're going to dive into advanced maintenance of your Benelli Ethos. We've covered basic disassembly and maintenance in a separate video. To see that video, check out the link in the description below. Ethan, what about for someone who wants to take the maintenance of their Benelli Ethos even further?
Sure. If you're shooting and you notice maybe the bolt is starting to seem a little sluggish, like it might be dirty, or even if the gun has been completely submerged underwater.
It happens.
It does. And then you may need to go a step further, so I'll show you what we'll do.
Okay.
The bolt is already out, so we'll start with the bolt assembly. The bolt handle you can pull out by hand, or if it's tight, you can go from the left side and tap it out with a punch. The firing pin retaining pin on the left side of the bolt can be pushed out with a punch, but be sure to cover the back of the firing pin because it will shoot out. It's under spring tension. So in there you have a firing pin and a spring. And the firing pin goes through this locking head pin. So once that's out, the locking head pin will drop out.
Okay.
And the locking head will pull out of the bolt. And there's also an inertia spring in there, and you may need to hook that with a pick or something to slide it past that detent. From there, clean this out, blow it out with compressed air, use a brush out the notches, brush out the front of the locking head, make sure there's no buildup or anything like that on the bolt body, on the link. The locking head itself, and this is very important, you want to make sure that the firing pin protrudes through the front of the locking head. If it doesn't, there's probably some fouling buildup in here, and to clean it, you can use the actual firing pin and just kind of push that stuff through.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll take a small drill bit and just spin it by hand inside that channel and just clean it out. But make sure that protrudes all the way. Once all this is clean, you can apply some oil to the inertia spring. Push it back in the bolt. Oil the locking head. Push that one back in. The locking head pin has a little line on top.
Okay.
And that can go either way, forward or back. That just indicates where the hole is for the firing pin to go through.
Sure.
Firing pin and firing pin spring can be pushed into the back of the bolt by hand. And the firing pin retaining pin pushed in place. So no special tools needed for that.
Not too bad.
Yeah, and the bolt handle, we can pop that right back in. So the bolt's clean, oiled, we can set that aside. And now we'll want to clean the receiver.
Okay.
So to get started with the receiver, we'll remove the trigger assembly. And there's one pin that goes through the receiver here. That can simply be tapped out with a punch. That's the trigger guard pin. To remove the trigger assembly, always push the bolt release button. That pivots the shell latch out of the way and allows it to drop out.
Okay.
So the trigger assembly, what you can do here is go ahead and turn it on fire and release the hammer, and then just blow this out with compressed air.
Okay.
You don't want to over oil this. You don't want this soaked. A little bit's good. I like to have some oil on my hands as I'm working with it, putting it back together.
But not necessarily applying more oil to that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Just maybe just one shot out of an aerosol can. Just wipe the oil around the carrier and the hammer. Hammer spring cap. If you see any rust on here, then for sure wipe that off. Oil the rusted area.
Okay.
That kind of thing. But compressed air is going to be the best way to clean this. And then with the hammer where with the safety still on fire, you can recock the hammer.
Okay.
So we'll set that aside for now. To clean the rest of the receiver, we'll go ahead and remove the stock. There's 2 Phillips head screws in the recoil pad, and I like to put a little bit of oil on the pad just so we don't damage the rubber. Recoil pad comes off. There's 2 more Phillips head screws to remove the progressive comfort assembly.
Okay.
These come all the way out. The recoil pad screws will stay in the pad. The progressive comfort assembly will slide out of the stock. From there, we'll notice a 13 millimeter nut down inside the stock, where I'll use a socket wrench or a T-handle to remove that. Once that nut is loose, the stock will pull away from the receiver, but there is some hardware in here. We'll notice we have a locking plate, a lock washer, and a stock nut. Set the stock aside. Then we have our drop shims. Drop shim and cast shim will come away. And then we just have our receiver with the recoil tube and the magazine tube. And we want to go ahead and clean both of these.
Okay.
So each one has a plug, and each one of those plugs have flat so you can get a wrench on it. If they've never been off before, there is a nylon ring in here, and they will be a little tight. They'll be kind of hard to remove. So you can put the receiver in a padded vise and then take a wrench on each end to unscrew these plugs. Once they've been off once, they'll be easier to put on, take off.
Makes sense.
But the first time, they will be a little tight. So we'll take a 17 millimeter to the recoil tube and remove the plug. This one is under spring tension, so we want to be careful. There's the plug. We have a recoil spring and a recoil spring plunger. Now, if the bolt is slowing down, or if the gun's never been cleaned, this is where you're going to have some buildup that you'll want to wipe down. So, take a shop towel, parts washer, whatever you have to clean all the coils of the spring, clean the plunger. This could be a dirtier area of the gun, so we'll do that. And then for the magazine tube, this one has a plug as well. Same thing, it might be a little bit tight if it's never been removed before. If you do need to use a vise, always put the receiver in the vise, never put the tube. Now for this example, we have a 28 gauge, and both of these springs look very similar on a 28 gauge.
So don't get those mixed up.
Exactly, yeah, 12 and a 20, you won't have that problem. The magazine spring is wider diameter. On a 28, these two are very similar, so keep them separate. Have a plug for the magazine tube. You see the magazine spring and that one pretty close.
Yep, very similar.
So, yep, we're going to keep those separate. In here we have a magazine follower. For the 28 gauge that we have here, this one has a crimped magazine tube. That's not going to come all the way out. Okay. So clean that the best you can with the follower in there. Maybe a small bore mop, maybe a pistol cleaning rod with a patch. Go in there and clean that out. If you have a 12 or 20 gauge, then your magazine follower will come all the way out. Clean it, replace it if you need to, if it's an older one. And then from there, any of this you can blow out with compressed air, solvent. This will be, you want to make sure this tube is clean. Same thing, maybe a pistol rod with a patch on it. You can go in here, just make sure that's all cleaned out.
Okay.
And then we can reassemble.
Okay.
And the recoil spring and the plunger, we do want to oil that pretty heavily, because that's something that probably won't come out for a while.
Right.
You know, it could be in
maybe
there for
years before you see that again.
It could be. Yeah, it could be. You know, it could be 10 years before you take this out again. So you can oil the front of this, oil the body of it fairly heavily. Make sure it's clean. And it'll slide back in the tube. And then we can take the plug and put it back on.
Okay.
And for that, hold the receiver. I wrap my thumb around the tube. You'll feel the tension when you get to that nylon ring. And hand tight is fine.
Okay.
The magazine tube plug is a little more important, because this actually goes in here in the barrel hanger.
Right.
And if this isn't in the correct spot, then your barrel might not be seated all the way. So you want to make sure to get this back on correctly. So magazine spring goes in. And the magazine tube, leave that dry.
Okay.
You don't want to put too much oil in there, because that's feathers will collect in there, sand. So magazine tube, just make sure it's clean, but leave it dry inside.
Okay.
Now this plug will start it. And you can see on the tube here, this one has just a witness line scribed into the tube. And there's also one on the plug.
Okay.
So we want to line those up. As we're coming around, you can see it. Want to make sure that line meets the other one. Those witness marks line up. That's indication this plug is all the way down where it needs to be, and the barrel can fully be seated.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. Trigger assembly, to put it back in, push the bolt release button. The shell latch will lever out of the way. Trigger guard pin. Our stock shims. We have a drop shim, a cast shim, and then our stock. There is a plastic stock spacer in here as well. Will likely stay in place. This one it did. And on top of that goes our locking plate, lock washer, and stock nut.
Okay. And
these can get dirty and rusted as well and be hard to remove. So normally I like to make sure they're clean. Make sure there's no rust on them. Go ahead and put a little bit of oil, because if they get rusted and seized in place, it could be much harder to remove next time.
Okay.
Locking plate. To get that washer, I'm going to need a rod, and that's just to guide it down in place over the stock bolt. And then the stock nut. Hand tight on the stock nut. And then we can put the progressive comfort assembly back in. 2 Phillips head screws. I'm going to use a drill to put them in. But be careful, I've got the torque set way low. We don't want to damage the stock.
Sure.
And then our recoil pad. Bolt assembly, always a good idea. Oil the rails. And the locking head pin channel. That slides in the front of the receiver. And we can then reassemble. It's all set, ready to go.
So again, that seems like a lot, but that's not something that we're having to do very often.
Yeah, like I say, that's just something if you notice the bolt is slowing down, if it seems sluggish as you're shooting, or if there's been some sort of incident where the gun was completely soaked,
right?
Then that might be where you want to look. And that goes for older Benellis as well. If you have an older Montefeltro Legacy, same process for cleaning.
All right, thanks for showing us that, Ethan. For more detailed information on your Benelli Ethos, you can always refer back to your owner's manual or visit BenelliUSA.com.